Ça marche? Allô? Ça marche? Oui? Alors, on me dit de vous dire que, comme on va faire cette intervention en anglais, il y a
This
des casques
conversation
de
will
traduction
take place
simultanée.
in English,
Juste là,
so
à
if you
l'information.
need to listen to
Et
interpretation,
donc, voilà, si vous voulez des casques, c'est très facile.
do not hesitate to go and see the gentleman over here and do ask for a headset. We thought we could have part of it in English, one part of it in French, but we want to make sure Yasufumi Nakamori will be taking part fully in the conversation, so there is no interpretation required directly between us. But of course, do not hesitate to take a headset to listen to this conversation in French.
Je répète pour ceux qui viennent d'arriver, la conversation sera en anglais. Et donc, si vous voulez des casques de
This conversation will take place in English,
juste là, les tiens à votre disposition.
so do not hesitate to get hold of headphones, of some headsets here from this gentleman who will provide them to you if you would like to listen to this conversation in French. Yes, there are also 2 seats available here in the front.
We go? Alors, bonjour. Hello, everyone. So I am Diane Dufour. I am the founding director of Le Bal. If you've never been to Le Bal, you should go. It's only 4 subway stations from here. We have now this wonderful Yasuhiro Ishimoto exhibition, which I put up together for the last, let's say, 4 years, including the pandemics. The way we're gonna, so let me introduce you to my friends and colleagues. Agathe Cancellieri, who is a director of La Galerie Rouge in Paris, representing a lot of wonderful photographers, including many of the Chicago School photographers. And she's been doing a PhD on the Chicago School. So her contribution to this conversation will be mostly on the years that Ishimoto has spent in at the ID, Institute of Design, called the New Bauhaus. And Yasufumi Nakamori, who used to run photography at the Tate Modern and did also his PhD on the Ishimoto, but on a very specific case of the Katsura Imperial Villa and the relationship with Kenzo Tenge. So he will explain in detail everything about that very crucial part of Ishimoto's work. And now he's a director of the Asian Society in New York, and it's a great pleasure. He's coming especially for the talk from New York, so we are very pleased. Thank you, Yasufumi, for this great effort. And I must say that Yasufumi was a great inspiration. He did, when he was running photography at the Museum of Fine Art in Houston, he did incredible shows about Japanese photography and art in general. And so it was a great inspiration for the shows we have done at Le Bal about Japan. So just I will make an introduction, and then I will leave the floor to Agathe, and then I will leave the floor to Yasu, and then we can conclude and ask for your questions. So that, and I think we have 1 hour. Yes, okay. So the idea behind the show, Le Bal is a fully independent, not-for-profit place. So basically, it was difficult to start, difficult to create, difficult to found, and difficult to sustain. But the nice thing about it is that more or less we are free to decide on the shows we want to do. And one thing I very early understood creating Le Bal is that Le Bal needed to add something to the French scene. And as you know, in Paris, we have a lot of places dealing with photography, Le Jeu de Paume, la MEP, la Fondation Cartier-Bresson, and so on and so forth. And so I didn't want Le Bal to be seen as a small Jeu de Paume or a small MEP. So very early on, I decided that I would do shows that will be more maybe concentrating on one historical aspect or one forgotten figure in history of photography, video, and cinema, because Le Bal is about photography, cinema, and video. So to do things which are what we can call research show or discovery show, avoiding the retrospective mode, because I think too many museums, not too many, many museums are doing maybe too many retrospectives, or I think it is a kind of very rewarding for the museum mode. Of course, a lot of people are like to see retrospective, but that's not the route I have taken at Le Bal. And so Yasuhiro Ishimoto is one line, it's part of one line of a program that I call The Forgotten, because history of photography is quite unfair, like all histories of medium, and is leaving apart key figures who were important at the time. You know, they did something really special, really talented, really like something that was never done before, and very influential to many people. But then, sort of, they were forgotten. So in that line, we did Dave East, we did Mark Cohen. Chris Killip was the first presentation of Chris Killip in France. So I'm trying to fill up gaps of things that are not shown in other museums. So specifically for Ishimoto, what has driven me to him is that we did a few years ago in 2016 a show about all the 60s in Japan. So it was called Provoke, like the Provoke magazine, including Takikoji, Nakaira, Moriyama, Takanashi. And we were using this kind of small magazine, only 4 issues, 68, 69, 70, to cross over all the visual art scene in Japan. So from, let's say, the most documentary part, Kendamon, Tomatsu, Ogawa, Kitai, to the most experimental scene, Aihead Center, Terayama, Nakaira, Takamatsu, Okada, you know, all the Araki, the first Arakis. So it was really a complete survey of this incredibly interesting and incredibly, how do you say, exploding scene visually at the time. But I was left with a little question, with a little enigma. And this question was, how in Japanese photography do we move after the war, the post-war, to this very dominant mode of social documentary, social realism? So, you know, the people, Ken Domon, Kimura, Amaya, you know, these people are trying to record how Japan after the war is basically in a disaster state. You know, they are picturing soldiers coming back from the front, or they are featuring homeless people, or they're featuring prostitutes working with GIs. So they are really socially concerned. And how do we move from that very dominant mode all over in magazines, all over in books, to, let's say, Nakaira, who was maybe one of the most conceptual artists in the late 60s in Japan. So of course, there's many answers to that question, and many people that are the in between. But reading again a book, and maybe I'm going to show that to you now. So this is a Provoke catalog, and you see Nakaira featured by Moriyama. And so I read this book again, this catalog of the exhibition in 1974 at the MoMA, New Japanese Photography. It is the first time ever that a museum is presenting a full panorama of Japanese photography outside of Japan. So it's a very important step, of course. Published the exhibition takes place in 1974, and it's co-curated by Sarkovsky, who is the head of photography at the MoMA at the time, and Yamagishi, who is the head of Camera Manichi, the main editor of Camera Manichi in Japan. And both are presenting this new generation. So the text is really about, and I think I brought it to you. Okay, this is the text of the catalog. And as you can see, it's presenting all these incredible people, Ozoe, Ishimura, Fukase, of course, and Moriyama, and Ken Ohara, and so if you read carefully where I put the yellow signs, I'm going to read it for you. Many of the essentials of modern photography were learned in the post-war period from Yasuhiro Ishimoto, who brought them from the United States when he returned to Japan. Although it might have been possible to learn the philosophy and techniques of modern photography from someone else, I would like to make clear that without Ishimoto, we would never have achieved today's photography. Wow. I was like, okay, Ishimoto. So I knew Ishimoto because Ishimoto is one of the main early representatives of the Chicago school. So, you know, I knew he was part of that, let's say, visual family that Agathe is going to talk about. But I was never aware that he was a kind of leverage bridge figure between post-war social documentary realism and let's say most experimental or conceptual mode. So I went to Kochi in the south of Japan, on the Shikoku Island, south of Shikoku. If you've been to Naoshima and Teshima Islands, south, big island, Shikoku, south of Shikoku, Museum of Fine Art, Kochi, because in 2012, Ishimoto is going to die without children. And so he's going to donate all his work, all his life, all his documentation to the Museum of Fine Art in Kochi. And so I wanted to focus and to answer my question, why is Ishimoto quoted as one of the main, how do you say, in-between character in that period? And so I've asked to see the vintage of the first period. And then I was flabbergasted because I understood what Yamagishi meant. And the show at Le Bal is about understanding why Ishimoto at some point was extremely influential, not only for Japanese photography, but for the whole scene, the whole avant-garde scene, architect, urbanist, graphic designer, and photographers in the 50s, so very early on in Japan. So it took us some years to convince the Museum of Kochi to bring the jewels, let's say the gems of the collection, to vintage prints to Le Bal, but we did. So you can see 169 vintage prints at Le Bal, done mostly by Ishimoto himself. So which are the first time that such a rare collection of vintage prints can be seen together. So it's quite remarkable endeavor, especially because since these prints are going to be shown for 6 months at Le Bal, they are going to rest for 3 years. So it is really a great chance for the public to enjoy contemplating these prints. So to really understand why Ishimoto was at that time so influential, and it's a kind of precise date and place, we have a little bit to explain how he started in life, because his destiny is also a very striking point. His destiny was in between Japan and America and the US, and I have to maybe introduce that part so that you understand how he gets to the new Bauhaus and then how he gets back to Japan. So the beginning is that he was born in 1921 in San Francisco, which is quite amazing from Japan, or not so obvious, from Japanese parents. His father was a farmer. So his father was working in a salt factory in California. And so this little baby, Ishimoto, got a very nice gift when he was born, which is an American passport. And so at 3 years old, his family is going to go back to Japan. The father is going to start farming the land near Kochi in Shikoku Island. And so Ishimoto is going to be raised like a little kid and then teenagers in entre-deux-guerres, in between the two wars. And he's preparing himself to take over the farm, his father's farm. But in 1939, his mother, I think because, of course, she doesn't want him to be enrolled in the Japanese army, sends him back to finish his agricultural studies in California. And so he's sent alone, he goes alone to California back in 1939. And he does some agricultural studies. But in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, of course, you know that all the American citizens from Japanese origins are going to be regrouped in camps. And Ishimoto is going to spend 3 years during the war in one of the most famous camps in America, in Colorado, called Amachi. And here, in the camp, there's something very awkward happening, is that in the camp, there is a poster making workshop. They are producing large posters for the American Marine, Join the Marine. And it's a lithography workshop where Ishimoto is discovering the printing techniques and working in the camp with some comrades, with fellows. And after 1943, they are allowed to have cameras in the camp, so they are starting to make pictures. And one day he's working in this poster workshop, and there is an accident, and he nearly lost an eye. And the surgeon who is repairing his eye says, "Oh, it's a miracle. I have repaired your eye, and you can see it's a miracle." And from that point, Ishimoto is going to decide not to become a farmer, but to become either an architect or a photographer. In 1944, he's going to be released from the camp. And again, you can see history is bringing, how do you say, we say in French, dig or pass. He cannot go, he's forbidden to go to the East Coast or to the West Coast of America. He wants to stay in America. And so a little bit par dépit, as a second choice, is going to Chicago.
Actually, if I could just add one thing there.
Please do.
So because Ishimoto was born in US, went back to Japan, and then came back. So American authorities thought that he came back with a dangerous ideology. So he was not allowed to move to any of the coastal city where new ideas came to US. He was called as a Kibei Nisei, meaning returnnees, with a dangerous ideology. So that was the reason why he ended up going to Chicago. and then soon, he moved to Chicago. He was photographing actually even before he moved to Amachi. He bought the first camera, but he left that behind when he was brought into the internment
Into the
camp.
camp.
Yes, it's interesting stories. There are also a wonderful community of Japanese American photographers within the camp. So, I think after he moved to Chicago, he enrolled in Dearborn Camera Club, which was a salon photographers club.
Of amateurs,
right?
yes.
So maybe that's where maybe you can come in.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Agathe.
So we understood that Ishimoto came to Chicago almost by chance or accident. And he enrolled first as an architect at the Northwestern University. And he met some amateurs photographers in this small club called the Dearborn. I'm going to try to. So he arrived in Chicago and hanging out in this club and making photographs, he realized that he loved photography, but he didn't know much about it in terms of art and techniques. So he decided, he went to a bookstore and he bought two groundbreaking books at the time. It was Georgi Kepes, Language of Vision, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Vision in Motions. So two Bauhaus teachers who moved to United States in the 30s. So he was reading these books and somebody told him, well, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy founded a school that still exists in Chicago that was called in 1937 New Bauhaus, and that became in 1944 the Institute of Design. So he contacted the school and he learned that Eric Allan was running the department of photography. So he contacted him, showed him his portfolio. And Eric Allan was not impressed. He wrote about that, but he thought that Ishimoto was so driven and so excited to come to the Institute of Design that he thought, well, I'll give him a chance. It was a very small program of photography. It was run by Arthur Siegel at the time and Eric Allan. And it was in the Institute of Design, which was a school made for designers first. So this small department was kind of an anomaly at first. And it was created as a light workshop, so to train designers to use lights and to know how to use photography as a medium to help them make design. So that was the beginning of it. So when Ishimoto started, I'm gonna skip. So that was Callan. I'm gonna say a few words about Callan, but we'll go back to his influence on Ishimoto. Callan, he was a photographer from Detroit, totally self-taught, and he never had taught before in a school when he arrived at the Institute of Design. So the first thing he did is to kind of create a program from the exercise that the Bauhaus teachers had created, and to make them, to apply them for himself in his work, but also to ask students to do them. So I'm just going to skip to, I'll go back to up. So the program would start with the foundation course, which is the first thing that Ishimoto did. They would start by exercise. So the first exercise were photograms, light modulators. And when we know Ishimoto's work, he did many light modulators even at the end of his life, because he used paper to render different tonalities. I'll show you some example. So this is some photograms that were made at the school. And this is some light modulators that were made. So it was papers that were cut and photographed differently with different sources of light in order to create forms and abstract forms. And the last exercise that was asked a student to do that Ishimoto also would experiment with was the light box, which was a box made by students with objects that were hanging. And with one source of light, they would compose photographs with shadows and lights. Which brings me to then the work of Ishimoto, because from this exercise made in the studios, with the influence of Ari Callahan, who was very much a photographer that would like to be out in the world, he would push his students to go from the studio to the streets. And then students would apply what they had learned in the studio to the streets of Chicago. So this is a series that we can see at Le Bal, where Ishimoto took pictures of pedestrians next to a pole. And what he's interested in is like how the actual physical figure play with the shadow and how little by little the physical figure is replaced by the shadow. And we don't really know if the projection is what counts in the pictures or the figure itself. So to continue about Ishimoto's work from what he had learned at the Institute of Design, it's also this idea of the city as a graphic space or the image as a graphic space. So he would really treat it as a design object. And so we can see in this picture how the light is kind of cutting the space of the streets and making it very dramatic with the light and the contrast between darkness and lights. And this resonates with some pictures made by his professor Callahan, where Callahan used the Chicago as a stage with this very striking light. So I'm going to go through a few exercises to show you the influence that his education had on Ishimoto. So this was another exercise where Callahan would ask his students to make pictures with roughly 60% of the picture or 80% had to be of a sky or snow. And in order to create contrast between the objects and the background.
Interesting, actually. Ishimoto told me that the same exercise was that 90% of the negative should be white, blank, and then 10% something else. But he was in the same class, certainly.
Yes. So that was an exercise that would allow the students to create from a sort of new vocabulary of urban objects and to transform them in something else than just what they were, just poles or light street lamps. And from this exercise, we can see that Ishimoto, who from his time in Chicago, he really explored different neighborhoods. He got interested also into a more documentary approach. He applied also this exercise to human figures and to images that were more documentary-like. So this is a young boy a picture, I think, that was taken in the south side of Chicago. You know, Chicago is a very segregated city. It was at the time, it still is. So the south side and the west side were mainly African American neighborhoods. And Ishimoto we'll talk more about that, but would go often in these neighborhoods. And here he succeeded to transform the exercise that was given by his professor to something that's kind of link documentary and more graphic, abstract, expressionism photography.
I think that was also in a class taught by Aaron Siskin.
Yes.
You know, yeah. Aaron came from really social documentary practice, right? You know, shot in East Harlem, actually, before he came to Chicago. So it's a nice kind of confluence of teaching you see in Ishimoto's work while he was at ID.
Yes, because Aaron Siskin, so that was the second professor. He came a little bit later because Ishimoto arrived in 1949. 48, sorry, yes. 48, at the Institute of Design, and Aaron Siskin joined in 1951. But he knew very well Callahan, and many times Callahan asked him to join the Institute of Design, but Aaron Siskin was in New York. He was an important figure of the Photo League, which was a group of documentary photographers in New York. So he had effectively an influence on Ishimoto's work and how to link this idea of photography as a tool to capture light, but also as a tool to capture documentary life. Yes. So that was to show you more examples of this idea of contrast in photography that was used at the Institute of Design. So this is work by Ari Callahan, where he photographed objects against the snow. And Ishimoto said that he didn't see much of Callahan's work when he was a student of his, because Callahan didn't like to teach by imitation. He really taught by doing. He was like, if you want to become a photographer, you have to do, you have to experiment. Accident is a key to explore, to discover new things.
You know, that's very different from much the way, Moholy taught. Because for Moholy, photography has to be experiments, but in like a dark room.
Yes.
Or, sort of like a formalism, right? I mean, relationship between the light and shape and colors. But Harry Callahan was actually sort of like let the nature takes sort of like a world.
Yes.
He wasn't controlling that much. He really believed in chance.
Yes.
I think that was a major difference between the way Harry Callahan taught and also Moholy taught. So Ishimoto came actually in between. So I see that the influence from both teachers in his work. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
But it's a very interesting point you're raising.
Yes.
So
no, definitely, and Callahan was all about like go out in the objective world and see what happens and what you find.
And Ishimoto said to me that he only saw 3 prints made by Callahan while he was studying from Callahan. So as you said, Callahan didn't want to teach from his own prints.
Yes. And one of the print that he saw, it was Live Against the Snow. That he saw of, this is Against the Sky, but to show you, I didn't have another. But so the one of the 3 images that Ishimoto say he saw of Callahan was a plant against the snow. And it gave him the idea to do, so that's another Callahan, to do this series of cars covered with snow. So basically, he wanted to reverse the subject, the motive of Callahan. Instead of doing a white background with a dark object, he wanted to reverse that. But at the same time, it's kind of very genius, because it's really an object of the world. Like we can recognize the car. It's actually like this motif of a car will show up against with other students of the Institute of Design, like Kenneth Josephson. He's going to do a famous Stockholm car with the snow that melts around the shadow of a car. So it's really, that's just to say also that Ishimoto started to influence other students of the Institute of Design by the work he made. But
Agathe, we have to leave the floor to.
sure.
So just I don't know if you have a few pictures of the doors, but it would be maybe interesting
Yes.
to just to show the Aaron Siskin's influence. We've talked. Oh, that's a very interesting picture. Maybe I can comment on that.
Yeah.
Here, Ishimoto is doing something very strange. You know, it's a picture of a broken window. So Ishimoto is printing the picture, stitching on the print as if he was repairing the window and reprinting the picture again. So it's a kind of conceptual gesture that is very awkward and very different from anything he's done apart from that. But I think it shows how free or experimental Ishimoto was. No, just to show the doors, if we...
it's the next one.
Yeah, Aaron Siskin. Yeah. So Aaron Siskin, Agathe told you that he was a representative of the Photo League, but during the war he would stop and he would start his second life as a photographer to shoot surface and walls and floors in a very abstract way. And I think when he's giving this exercise to the students to shoot the doors in the south side, it's driven from the beginning of the abstract expressionism movement. Aaron Siskin is very close to Barnett Newman. Barnett Newman in 1948, exactly at the time when Ishimoto is entering the idea, is painting his very famous series called One Month, that he would call Zip later on. So just a color surface, one color, and in the middle, another color, like a zip of a trousers. And this idea of the surface is something becoming extremely important at the time. I think in this series, Ishimoto is not so much interested in anthropological sign, like maybe Walker Evans would do, but is more interested in really a pictorial effect, like maybe the Jasper Jones American flag or something like that, or Barnett Newman or a Rothko, you know, but really to bring aplat within French, to bring fields in the picture. So it's very interesting that basically we understand that after the Bauhaus year, Ishimoto's construction of a gaze, you have the experimentation of Laszlo Molinaj, you have the concern for straight photography from Callahan, and you have the pictorial concern and way of shooting by Aaron Siskin. So we should move on because otherwise we have no time. But then what's going to happen is that one of the famous series that Ishimoto is going to do, the legs at the counter. I don't know if we have pictures of that. Otherwise, I'll move to my Okay, if you can stop. The legs at the counter on the beach in Chicago are going to be collected and exhibited at the MoMA in New York very early on, 1953. So Ishimoto is going to get a very early recognition of his work. In 1952, when he's graduating from the idea, Steichen, the head of photography at the MoMA, is sending him back to Japan. After 14 years, Ishimoto is coming back to Japan. You know, he has not seen his family for 14 years. He doesn't know Tokyo. He speaks an average Japanese. He sees himself as an American photographer. So he's really coming back as a stranger. He hasn't, of course, been in Japan during the war and during after war. So he's really, like on another planet. And the reason why Steichen is asking him to go back is two things. One, to find Japanese photographers for the Family of Man exhibition he's preparing, which Ishimoto is not going to do. And the second thing is to accompany Arthur Drexler, who is a curator at the MoMA for architecture and design, to tour the traditional architectural sites in Japan. And here comes Katsura, and Katsura is going to be a game changer for Ishimoto. And Yasu, you're gonna tell us a little bit about Katsura.
So when I was working my doctoral dissertation years ago, I was a student at Cornell University in America, and I decided to write on the relationship between photographers and also architects. And I was interested in sort of like a 25 years, 1945 to 1970, when Japan was coming back basically as a modern nation, after the war, how architects use photography often, cutting and pasting and molding, and what kind of, partnership was there. So that's how I stumbled upon Ishimoto. And I spent 1 year with him from 2007 to 2008. He was still living, and he and I dug lots of prints, and, he pulled a lot of documents, records, prints he had never shown to anyone. So I had a pleasure to work with him, tracing how the 1960 publication Katsura was made into presence. Let's see. So anyway, you may have been to Katsura. So just to bring you back to 1953, when Ishimoto went back to Japan, as Diane said, Arthur Drexler, he was the director of architecture at the Museum of Modern Art. He and Ishimoto went around Kyoto and Nara and other parts, looking at the traditional architecture, temples, shrines, and minka, Japanese houses, for the 1953 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, House in the Garden. So Drexler was looking for a Japanese structure to rebuild in New York City. And as a part of the research, they spent the time in Katsura Villa, which was built in over 50 years in 17th century. It's in Kyoto. You may have been there. 4 tea houses, 1 Buddhist hall, and then 3 residences in a beautiful, imperial garden. And so for Ishimoto, being in that imperial palace, looking at traditional architecture was such an eye-opening experience to him. So he shot actually over 2 years, more than 600 photographs using his Linhof camera, 6x10, using 4 different lenses, 90 to 210 millimeters, I think. Then, Kenzo Tange, who is an architect, who was invited to write an essay, ended up taking over the project. He became actually the photo and book editor for the book came out 7 years later, 1960. This is one of the most important Japanese photo books came out in the entire history of photography. Designed by Herbert Bayer, an Australian Bauhaus designer. He designed this beautiful cover with this bold, blue, beautiful color, plus this round white definitely signifies map of, I think, the flag of Japan. But then Tange, he looked at photos and he was very impressed by the way Ishimoto looked at 17th century in a modern way. So for Ishimoto, as a matter of fact, I just go really fast. Ishimoto Tange, who was an architect and became a book editor for this book, and his first wife, Kato Toshiko. Again, some works from ID days, right? I'm gonna skip really fast. And again, this is the point, right? I love Ishimoto's untitled work. And then he also photographed Miss van der Rohe's Lakeshore apartment, which just came out in 1951. This is actually work by Ishimoto from school days. And then this was the first picture he shot in Katsura. Look at this. So what was great about this is though, so sorry, going back. Ooh, I want to go back. Okay, apology. So for him, this was the way he photographed 17th century Japanese architecture. For him, this was Mondrian. So in the exhibition I organized years ago, 2010 at the Museum of Science Houston, this was my first exhibition as a curator. I pulled a Mondrian painting from museum collection and showed Ishimoto's picture from Lakeshore Drive in Chicago compared to his first picture shot in Katsura. So this was the way he looked at Japanese tradition.
Yasu, we can maybe quote Ishimoto on that because he said a very important thing when he arrives in Katsura. He says, I was flabbergasted to discover in Katsura the same kind of modernity that I discovered in the Loop in Chicago, but not only the same modernity, but to come back to its source. The source of Western modernity would, according to Ishimoto, can be found in Katsura 17th century architecture. And this, the way Ishimoto is doing a kind of circle that Japanese architecture has been influential to modernist Western architecture, and he's coming back to Katsura to zoom on Katsura, basically, and a kind of betraying the architecture because he's not doing architectural picture. He's looking in Katsura to find the seed of modernist architecture in the Western world.
I mean, I think that's interesting thing is Tange was also a photographer himself. You know, he was 10 years older than Ishimoto. By early 50s, he had become de facto national architect of Japan. He took lots of commissions to rebuild Japan's cities were destroyed completely. Hiroshima, was his project. But then Tange was also going around and photographed traditional Japanese architecture, particularly same, Katsura. So my research as a student was that comparing how Tange was looking at 17th century architecture versus Ishimoto's way of looking at, same architecture. So I realized that Tange also often did not photograph the triangular roof. If you look at the Japanese architecture, it's always triangular roof, right? He omitted it. And that's what exactly Ishimoto did too. How sort of like two men, they looked at 17th century architecture in a similar fashion, very modern fashion. Kenzo Tange had an interesting sort of like a history as a young architect, looking at the war as a romantic event. So this is a drawing for the unbuilt memorial to the creation of the Great Asia Prosperity Fair. You see this kind of very hazy, landscape near Mount Fuji. You see Mount Fuji at the right top. There's a modern kind of structures in your kind of foreground and midground. That's where this basically architecture which signifies Japan's power in East Asia. And in this too, this is Tange's design, never realized, but he also looked at Japanese architecture, traditional architecture as a motif for modern design. You see triangular pavilion there, the roof in this. It's hard to kind of point out where it is, but this Japanese traditional looking architecture was made of reinforced concrete. So there's a merger between modern materials and traditional aesthetics. So that was something actually Tange was always fascinated by. So again, after the war ended, he became an important architect, in early 50s. He saw Ishimoto's fantastic photograph of Katsura. And then two men worked together to create this book, came out in 1960. So I'm just going to show some spreads. Look at this. He zoomed into the materiality and also kind of modern elements, which you couldn't tell whether they come from traditional architecture or modern architecture. Look, again, looked at actually the units in Japanese architecture, such as a shoji screen or part of tatami mat. These images were sequenced in a very cinematic way by Kenzo Tange. Tange was the book editor after all. This is one of the interior of Gepparo tea houses. This is a picture by Ishimoto. Then Tange zoomed in. So this red frame shows how picture was cropped by Tange without permission by Ishimoto. There you go. This is how this image came about. So I was very curious. I asked Mr. Ishimoto, what happened to this picture? He said, I went back to Chicago in 1956, right? 58. And when I was in Chicago, Tange just sort of like cropped my pictures, in a way he wanted. And then he sent me a book, to Chicago, and I saw this incredible, cropped image, but I kind of liked it. That's what he said. He said, when I wanted to see how I wanted to see Katsura wasn't so different from how Tange wanted to see, because he really wanted to see the connection between the traditional Japanese architecture and also direction of his modern design. I have another wonderful actually example here. Again, it's actually entrance into Katsura, right? Here we go. So this is how picture was cropped and appeared in the book. So this was done by Tange primarily, without permission of young Ishimoto.
No, but here, Yasu, we should explain that it's two steps. One, Ishimoto is zooming into the Katsura architecture with his Bauhaus eyes to find a Mondrian, a Brancusi, things which are not faithful, truthful to the architecture itself, but to find the seed of modernist architecture. So this is step one. This you can see the prints on the wall at Le Bal. Step two, Kenzo Tange is seeing Ishimoto's work, and he wants to take advantage of Ishimoto's work for his own benefit, because he wants to say, I will build incredibly futurist building, but with roots in traditional architecture. And then he's even cropping, zooming more in Ishimoto's picture without Ishimoto's permission. So basically he's appropriating Ishimoto's work. But we have to understand the two steps, because
Yes.
Kenzo Tange himself was not capable of going that far when he took the picture himself. So he's using Ishimoto's Bauhaus vision, an extremely abstract vision, to push his agenda forward. And that's
yes. So
and it's not only influential on Kenzo Tange. We
Yes.
have to explain, Yasu,
It's
that
interesting. I think actually, architects often like, Mies van der Rohe, for example, Mies actually cut and paste other people's, photograph to create his own vision. So, photography was often the sort of like a, base medium, and often, architects didn't really give much value to those, photographs. So I think that was the case in a relationship, between Ishimoto and Tange as well. So Tange employed Ishimoto to photograph his, brand new architecture like a Hiroshima Peace Center in late 50s. They worked together for a while, but however, the way Tange tried to control Ishimoto's vision, really upset Ishimoto. And after 1960s, they stopped working together. Let's take a look at this beautiful photograph of the stepping stones, right? 2 minutes, right? Yeah, we have to go like very soon. So it's also, he framed very tightly. Ishimoto did not crop his images, right? Everything is just, this is it for him. Look, this reminds me actually Aaron Siskin's pictures shot in Martha's Vineyard of stones, but also Hans Arp, So as modernists, actually, artists also try to look at traditional, values and images by creating, very organic shapes, images. So Ishimoto's, this is another kind of masterwork from Katsura. So I guess I'm done here, Diane.
Do you mind to move to my presentation? So, okay, so it's important to understand that this breakthrough that Ishimoto is going to do with the Katsura picture in Japan. So I'm going to move forward. Will not only affect Kenzo Tange, of course, but will affect all the visual art creation in Japan. The reason is two things. One is that at the time in Japan, there is this what they call the tradition debate. All the architects and urbanists and graphic designer, they debate very fiercely on a very simple thing. Should we, after the war, do tabula rasa? Because everything in the past history has led to the disaster of the Second World War. So should we start from scratch, or should we rebuild a very thin link from a very remote past in order to start again and go in a new direction? And Ishimoto, who doesn't see himself as Japanese anymore, who hasn't been in Japan during the war, who is not part really of this debate, but Kenzo Tange is. Basically, with this Katsura picture, with this kind of Mondrian picture, is cutting the debate. The debate is over. Clearly, in Japanese traditional architecture, were the seeds of modernist architecture, so we can move forward. And this is a very important thing, because years later, when Ishimoto is going to die in 2012, and in 2021, 3 museums in Japan are going to organize a retrospective of his work. And here comes a very famous Japanese architect, Arata Isozaki, who has maybe built 300 museums and art centers all over the world, but and especially in Japan, and who knew he was a student of Kenzo Tange, and he knew Ishimoto well, and he's going to say this extraordinary thing. He's going to say, after the war, only 2 people were capable of seeing Japan through the filter of modernity: Noguchi and Ishimoto. And he's going to add, Noguchi in sculpture and Ishimoto in photography have given a shape to Japan. So here you have to realize that Arata Isozaki is like Le Corbusier. And he's talking about Ishimoto, who of course is a great character and a great figure of Japanese photography, but is not like Moriyama, is not so well known. So you have this great architect paying tribute in a very, a shape to Japan in a huge, remarkable way to this Katsura picture. So they were a game changer. And they also, that's the second point, these pictures opened the door to the new kind of photography, vivo, provoque, the explosion of photography in the 60s. Why? Because with Ishimoto, and Agathe, we can say that maybe the one who really summarized it well is Aaron Siskin. He said, we are jumping from what does the world look like to how do I see the world, to what do I want to say about the world. And then we are back to the beginning. You understand that after the war, Kendamon, Kimura, Maya, they were trying to record the world as it is. But these people of Provoque, they don't believe in recording reality anymore with photography. They want to express the world, but not to record it. They deny this function to photography. So Ishimoto is going to open the door. Photography is a visual language that can express your ideas about the world. And this is a game changer for photography. But unfortunately, what's going to happen is that the lesson is going to be taken extremely well by this Provoque generation. And they are going to push so far photography and the visual languages that Ishimoto a little bit is going to be overwhelmed. So I used to say he's opening a door and the building is falling on him, if you understand what I mean.
I think, Ishimoto's influence was enormous, certainly, but then it was not necessarily kind of appreciated commercially in a way. And, of course, he had enormous respect among the photographic and also architects communities. I mean, going back to the Katsura book, that's perhaps actually the most influential book, looking at the modernity in Japanese art and culture through photography and architecture. So I think this Lobau show definitely gave another life to Ishimoto. Ishimoto used to tell me that towards the end of his life, Yasu, I'm not that famous. I'm not like a Daido Moriyama. And he was thinking about kind of how he built the legacy, moving forward. And when he passed 2012, everything was arranged for his entire collection to go to Kochi Museum in Shikoku. And then I have to point this out. He said to me, Yasu, you're going to Museum of Science Houston. I'll give you 300 pictures. Take them with you to Houston. That way, my picture will be seen also in America. Chicago Art Institute has also a huge collection of like 700 photographs by him. So his legacy is actually living still in those top museum collections in America, as well as Kochi. I don't know actually how he's going to be influential in Europe after your exhibition here in Paris.
I have no idea. But I want to finish on this final wall at Le Bal. These are among the last pictures taken by Ishimoto. Right. It's called the Toki project, and it's very moving in a way because these pictures are taken in Shibuya in Tokyo. So around 2000, and Ishimoto is shooting, what we say by the end, like this, not like this, like this, without looking through the viewfinder. And you can see that he's mastering space because the frames are exquisite and perfect without looking. And also time, because he wants the people to be blurred. He's working on utsuroi, which means transitory in Japanese. So he wants to show how transitory we are all in this life. So he wants the people to be blurred, but not too blurred or not too neat. So he's mastering time and space without looking in the viewfinder. But what's so moving, I think, Agathe and Yasu, for these pictures, is that after 60 years in photography, shooting all day long, and being really involved in photography the best he could, is still obsessed by lines and bodies. You can see the architecture, the Bauhaus influence is still there, the buildings behind, but you can see also Callahan, the figures moving. So it's still in that mode of putting together in an experimental way, molinage, the Bauhaus structure and the way to express an idea, in that case, a Buddhist idea of being transitory in this picture. And I think it's a very telling. Maybe also it's a tribute to Provoque, because as you know, the Provoque years were all about blurred pictures. So it's very nice that he stayed with this whole idea of being a very nice combination of all these layers into him, stayed until the end of his work time.
Minor White, actually, American photographer, said Ishimoto speaks English with a Japanese and German accents, right? The Bauhaus part is in German, certainly, and Japanese part is something he developed after he returned. And also, I think his pictures often, it's not about the ideology. It's not about the politics at all. He did not respond to like a late 60s, Japanese Provoque era shooting protesters at all. That was not his interest. I think he was really a formalist after all. So.
Alors, we have 2 minutes to open the floor to questions or things you're curious about. His fate, his destiny, or his pictures, or the Bauhaus years. Yes, please.
I was just curious. Thanks for the talk. It was really lovely to learn more about his work. I was curious if the editor, I can't remember his name. Was it Ken Tango? Did he ever make any sort of comment about editing his photographs down? As any did he ever kind of acknowledge it publicly?
He remained, silent on that. Yes. But
but you have to understand, Kenzo Tange, after the war, he has built the Hiroshima Memorial Peace. The Peace Memorial in Hiroshima in 1959. So is like Yasu said, is a great figure already. And Ishimoto has just graduated a few years ago. Is nobody. So of course it's easy now to say, and it's surely Kenzo Tange appropriated Ishimoto's work, but at the same time he brought value to Ishimoto's work. It's ambiguous because Ishimoto by himself would not have been able to do the 1960 book published by Yale University Press and published by a Japanese publisher. So it's a little bit this situation where, of course, you can say he played the bad guy, but not only, he also pushed
I think
forward
actually this case
Ishimoto's
study brought up, very ambiguous power relationship. Often you see between architect and photographer, right? When there's a book about architecture, if it's commissioned by architect, of course images, are going to belong to architect. But in this instance, that wasn't the case. So, this kind of, imbalancing, between image maker and architect, I think you see it all the time, even up to the present day. So, one more question.
There wasn't, yes, yes, please.
You mentioned minor white, and I'd just love to know, in my sort of sad Western American education, we learned a lot about Siskin, Callahan, connection to minor white, and Ishimoto was unfortunately really left out of the sort of tradition that between those three. And you mentioned minor white, and so I wanted to know if you could talk just a little bit more about the connection that came after Ishimoto and
minor white?
And minor white, yeah.
Minor white is discovering Ishimoto's work in 1960, when Ishimoto has the first retrospective in 1960 at the Art Institute of Chicago. And what Yasu said, Ishimoto is a visual bilinguist from Japanese culture. He speaks American with a German accent. Is saying that immediately after discovering his work in 1960 at the Art Institute of Chicago. But I don't. What's amazing about Ishimoto is that the formative years at Bauhaus were really the time with Katsura where he did his best work, and that's very unusual that a photographer being in a school is providing among his best work ever during his training, let's say. Minor White discovers Ishimoto much later. I mean, much later, a few years later. But, Ishimoto's Katsura, 1953, remember, Klein is going to do the New York in 1955. Robert Frank is going to start the American in 1955. So we are before Frank and before Klein, who are the obviously two masterpieces of post-war American photography, American and European. They were both Swiss, but so it's very important to reframe the time here, and that Ishimoto is very, very early on in the history of photography. Thank you so much. I think we have we are here, so we can.
Okay, thanks very much.